Some people say love is the one thing that can survive anything. But what happens when the person who loves you most becomes the one who destroys you first? This is the story of Serafina Vale, a woman who boarded a plane with a broken heart, survived the impossible, and came back to face the man who shattered her. A story about sacrifice so brutal it looks exactly like betrayal, about the lies we tell to protect the people we love, and the wreckage those lies leave behind. If this story grips you, hit that like button right now, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one doesn't let go. The terminal smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air, and the particular kind of desperation that collects in airports at 2 in the morning when the people passing through have nowhere left to pretend they want to be. Serafina Vale stood at Gate 18 of Chicago O'Hare with her boarding pass bent at the corner from how hard she'd been gripping it, and she told herself she was not going to cry. She told herself that with the same certainty she'd once used to tell herself that Dominic Viscari was a good man. Both statements had the same problem. She wanted them to be true so badly that she'd mistaken the wanting for evidence. The gate agent was calling final boarding. The sound came to her from somewhere distant, like a voice underwater. 30 minutes. That was all it had taken. 30 minutes for a 7-year marriage to be disassembled with the kind of clean efficiency that Dominic brought to every transaction, every contract, every negotiation where he needed something to end without complications. He'd met her in the private lounge, not their home, not anywhere that held any trace of who they'd been together, and he'd stood across a table that felt like a continent and told her it was over. She'd asked why. He'd looked at her the way he looked at subordinates who'd failed to grasp something obvious. Because it is, he said. I don't owe you more than that. The cruelty of it had been so precise that it hadn't registered as cruelty at first. It had registered as a mistake. Some catastrophic miscommunication she could correct if she just said the right thing, found the right angle, appealed to the version of him she knew existed somewhere beneath that expression. She'd heard herself start talking about their apartment, about the weekend in Savannah 2 months ago, where they'd stayed in bed until noon, and he'd laughed at something she said with his whole chest, and she'd thought, I will never stop loving this man. And she'd watched his face while she talked and seen nothing. Not coldness. Worse than coldness. Absence. Like she was describing memories from someone else's life, and he was being polite about it. Get on the plane, Serafina, he said, when she finally ran out of words. Leave. We're done. She'd stared at him for a moment that lasted longer than she could measure. I don't understand, she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. I know. He picked up the phone on the table without looking at her again. That's always been the problem. The gate agent was saying something else now. Serafina looked down at the boarding pass in her hand. Chicago to Miami. One way, she'd noticed. He hadn't even had the decency to book her a round trip, because he knew there was no version of tonight where she came back and anything looked the same. That detail, more than anything, made it feel real. He'd thought it through, he'd planned it. This wasn't a fight that had escalated past the point of control. This was a decision he'd made and then executed, and she'd walked into it without knowing she was walking in until the door was already locked behind her. She got on the plane. She didn't let herself look back. She didn't trust what she'd do if she turned around and saw him standing there watching her go. Or worse, not watching at all, already on his phone, already moving to the next item on the agenda. Serafina Vale had survived a lot of things in her 34 years. She had rebuilt herself from nothing twice before. She could survive this. She repeated that to herself as she found her seat. As the plane taxied from the gate, as the city lights of Chicago spread out below and then disappeared into the cloud cover, she survived it right up until the storm started. The turbulence came on fast. That was what she'd remember later. Not the violence of it, but the speed. One moment the cabin was quiet, and the hum of the engines was the particular white noise she'd learned to sleep through on the dozens of flights she'd taken in the years when she and Dominic had traveled constantly, when their life together had felt like the kind of life other people collected photographs of. Then the plane lurched sideways and the overhead compartments rattled, and somewhere in the cabin behind her someone made a short, sharp sound of fear. The flight attendants moved quickly to their seats. That was when Serafina understood the turbulence wasn't ordinary. She gripped the armrests. The plane dropped, genuinely dropped, not just dipped, and her stomach went with it, and for a surreal instant she thought about the conversation in the lounge and wondered if Dominic knew somehow. If there was a version of her sitting in some alternate terminal, having not gotten on the plane, and that version was currently furious and heartbroken and absolutely, unambiguously alive. The lights flickered. The pilot's voice came on, tight and controlled in the way that pilots' voices get when the control is doing real work. He said they were diverting around a weather system. He said they were looking at a significant delay. He did not say what Serafina, who had flown enough to read the spaces between the words, understood him to mean that the weather system had grown past the point of diverting around, that they were inside it now, and that the next several minutes were going to require everyone to be very still and very quiet, and, if they were the type, very sincere about whatever they believed in. She was not the type. She had spent the last 7 years in the orbit of Dominic Viscari, and in that orbit there was no room for anything that couldn't be bargained with or bought or controlled through superior strategy. She'd absorbed that worldview the way you absorb things from the people you love. Not through argument, but through proximity. Through the slow replacement of your own instincts with theirs. So she held on to the armrests and she didn't pray. She looked out the window at the absolute black of the storm, and she thought about what Dominic had said. Never strong enough for his world. The plane rolled hard to the left. The woman across the aisle made a sound that was half scream and cut off into silence, as though she'd caught herself. A bag fell from an overhead compartment somewhere in the back. The flight attendants were strapped into their jump seats with faces that gave nothing away, and Serafina understood that this particular blankness was trained and deliberate, that it was their version of what she was doing, holding the form of composure, because the alternative was losing it completely. Then the engines changed pitch. She'd never heard that sound before, and she hoped she would never hear it again. It wasn't a sound that required interpretation. It was the kind of sound that the body understood before the mind caught up, some deep animal register that translated it instantly and completely. Something is wrong with the machine. The cabin erupted, not in screams exactly, more in a rush of motion and sound, the collective animal panic of 43 people who had all just heard the same thing and arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. The attendant nearest Serafina was already on the intercom with a voice that had dropped all pretense of calm, instructing people to brace, instructing them to follow the emergency protocol, to check the card in the seat pocket in front of them. Serafina's hands wouldn't work right. She got her seatbelt tighter. She folded herself forward, arms over her head the way they'd always shown in those safety demonstrations she'd stopped watching years ago because nothing was ever actually going to happen. The plane was going down. Not falling. Not yet, but descending with a purpose that had nothing to do with the flight plan, and she was aware of the mountain terrain below them in the way that you're aware of a thing you've been told and never actually believed until this exact second. She thought about Dominic, not the man in the lounge, the other one, the one who'd stood in their kitchen in the early mornings before anyone else was awake, making coffee with a focus so intense. It was almost funny. The one who'd driven 2 hours in a snowstorm to bring her soup when she had the flu 2 years into their marriage because she'd mentioned, casually, on the phone, that she hadn't eaten. That man. The one she'd decided, somewhere in the last few hours, was either a fiction she'd constructed or someone who had genuinely ceased to exist. She thought, I never told him that I understood who he was underneath the rest of it. She thought, if this is how it ends, he'll think he was right to let me go. The impact came in stages. The first was the trees. She understood that later, when someone explained the flight data recorder, when the physics of it was laid out in the careful language of investigation, and she could process it as information rather than sensation. The trees absorbed a significant portion of the kinetic energy. The fuselage held, the plane didn't explode. What it did was tear itself open against the ground of a mountainside in the remote eastern range of Tennessee at 3:47 in the morning, in a storm that had knocked out radar contact and would keep search and rescue grounded for another 18 hours. Serafina came back to consciousness, to the smell of aviation fuel and pine and something metallic that she identified, with the strange calm of shock, as blood. Her blood. From a cut somewhere above her left eye. The cabin was dark except for the emergency floor lighting, which had somehow stayed on. Small orange beacons leading through the wreckage toward the emergency exits, assuming the emergency exits were still there to be found. She was alive. She checked herself for damage with the methodical focus of someone who hadn't yet allowed herself to feel anything. Laceration above the eye, bruised ribs, She could tell from the way every breath arrived at a cost. Left shoulder had taken something during impact. She could move the arm, but it sang with pain when she raised it past the horizontal. She was alive. She was relatively intact. She was on the side of a mountain in the middle of Tennessee, in the middle of a storm, in the middle of the night, and she was, in the most literal possible sense, on her own. She got out of the seat. The first thing she did was check the passengers around her. The man in the window seat beside her was unconscious but breathing, and she couldn't move him without risking his spine, so she left him and moved forward and backward through the cabin with the orange floor lights as her guide. 43 people on the manifest. She did a rough count in the wreckage. 31 who responded to her voice, some coherent and some not, some injured and some walking around in the particular floating unreality of unprocessed trauma. The rest she didn't let herself think about yet. Not yet. There was a man named Carl. She learned his name when he grabbed her arm and told her because he needed to assert his own existence to someone. She understood that, who turned out to have field medic training from 15 years in the Army. He became the most important person in the world to her within the next 4 minutes, because he could do the triage she couldn't. He moved through the cabin with a controlled purpose that she recognized. It was the same mode she'd seen Dominic operate in during crises, the same shutting down of everything peripheral so the essential work could happen. She let Carl do what he knew how to do. And she did what she knew how to do. She organized. She'd spent 7 years being the practical machinery behind Dominic's empire, not in the criminal architecture of it, which she'd known nothing about, but in the surface world, the legitimate business world, the events and logistics and the management of things that needed to be in specific places at specific times. She'd been good at it, better than he'd ever fully acknowledged. She moved through the situation now with that same skill, pulling people out of shock and into function, assigning the mobile and capable to tasks. Gather the emergency supplies from the overhead compartments, find and consolidate the survival kits from the emergency equipment bays, identify and mark the structural damage so people knew where the floor wasn't safe. The storm beat against what was left of the fuselage. Outside, through the gaps where the cabin had buckled, she could see the dark mass of the trees, the driving rain coming in at an angle. No visibility, no signal on her phone, no sound except the wind and the rain and the soft sounds of people in pain. She sat down on the armrest of a buckled seat and pressed her sleeve against the cut above her eye and allowed herself for exactly 1 minute to feel the full weight of the night. She had gotten on a plane with a broken heart. The man who'd broken it had stood in a private lounge and dismantled their marriage with surgical precision, and she had believed him, had believed every word of it, because she'd been so terrified that it was real that she hadn't looked hard enough for the cracks in his performance. She'd let herself be sent away like excess inventory, like something that no longer had a function in his operation. And now she was here. And Dominic didn't know. And for all she knew, by the time anyone found this mountain, she'd be a body in the wreckage and he'd hear about it on his phone, in some clean office, from some clean news brief. And he would go very still for a moment, and then he would make himself keep moving because that was what Dominic Viscari did. He kept moving. He did not stop for grief. He had built his entire existence around the principle that stopping was where you died. She thought about how much she hated him for that. Then she stood up, because a girl near the back of the cabin was crying in that quiet, steady way that means a person has given up on being heard, and someone needed to go sit with her. The night passed in increments. The rain didn't stop. The temperature dropped. They were at elevation. She guessed somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 feet based on the vegetation she could see when the lightning flashed, which gave her a rough geography and no useful information about how to act on it. They had 3 emergency survival kits from the aircraft, each stocked with a Mylar thermal blanket, a small first aid kit, a water purification packet, a signal mirror, a whistle. They had whatever had been in the passengers' carry-ons, snacks, mostly, and the occasional practical item, and 2 full water bottles from a woman named Deirdre who'd been traveling from a wellness retreat and had packed with the devotion of someone who believed deeply in hydration. Carl worked through the night. So did Serafina. They established a rotation, 2 people monitoring the critical injuries, 2 people keeping watch at the largest opening in the fuselage in case conditions changed, the rest resting in shifts. She didn't sleep. She didn't try. Every time she came close to it, something in her body rejected it, like there was an alarm running that wouldn't shut off. Around 4 in the morning, in the particular silence that falls even inside a storm when the rain slows briefly between surges, the man who'd been unconscious in the seat beside her. His name was James. She'd found his wallet while checking his vitals. Opened his eyes. He looked at her with the unfocused confusion of someone trying to locate himself from the beginning. "We're down," she told him. "You're hurt, but you're breathing. Don't try to move your neck. There's someone with medical training looking after you. You're going to be okay." She said it the way you say things when you don't know if they're true. But the person in front of you needs them to be true more than they need the honest version right now. James looked at her for a moment. His eyes moved over her face. The dried blood, the bruising already starting along her jaw, the deliberate steadiness she was projecting with every muscle she had. "You're not okay," he said. It was the first time in hours anyone had looked at her rather than past her, and she felt the observation land somewhere deep in her chest, and then controlled the impact. The way you control an explosion by surrounding it with enough structure to direct the force where you want it to go. "None of us are okay," she said. "That's fine. We don't need to be okay right now." Dawn came gray and wet and incrementally. The storm was breaking, not gone, but pulling back, the violence of it giving way to a heavy overcast that felt, by contrast, like peace. As light returned to the cabin through the gaps and the broken windows, she could see the full architecture of what they'd survived. The front section of the aircraft had held relatively intact. The rear had separated and lay 30 feet back up the slope, and she'd known since her initial count that not all of those passengers had made it. She didn't dwell on it. She couldn't afford to dwell on it. What she dwelt on instead, in the quiet spaces between tasks, was the specific geography of Dominic's face when he'd said we're done. She'd watched him in moments of performance before. She knew what it looked like when he was managing a room, when he was projecting confidence he didn't entirely feel, when he was building a version of himself for an audience. She'd told herself, in the lounge, that she'd seen none of that the blankness was real, that the absence was genuine. But in the gray dawn of a Tennessee mountainside, sitting with an aluminum blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a woman she'd never met sleeping against her arm, Serafina Vale turned the memory over and looked at it from a different angle, and she saw the crack. It had been in his hands. He'd held them very still, too still, the deliberate stillness of someone suppressing movement, rather than the natural stillness of someone at rest. She knew those hands. She'd watched them for 7 years. When Dominic was genuinely unmoved, his hands did nothing. When he was controlling something, containing something, they went rigid in exactly the way she was remembering now. She turned the memory over again and again. She thought about what it would cost a man like Dominic to look at the person he loved most and perform cruelty that precise. She thought about what would make it worth it. She didn't have an answer yet, but she had the question, which was more than she'd had at Gate 18, boarding a flight she hadn't wanted to take, believing a story she should have interrogated harder. By midday, the overcast had lifted enough that they could hear it, the distant percussion of a helicopter working a search pattern. Carl grabbed the signal mirror from the kit. Serafina grabbed the whistle. 2 other passengers found space at the tear in the fuselage and began making noise with whatever they had. The helicopter swung wide, then corrected. Then it came back. She stood at the edge of the wreckage in the thin mountain light, watching the aircraft descend toward a clearing 200 meters down the slope, and she felt the relief move through her like a physical thing. But it moved through her changed, coming out the other side as something harder and quieter than relief. She was alive. Whatever Dominic had done, whatever his reasons, she had gotten on a plane he sent her to and nearly died on a mountainside in Tennessee. And she was alive. And she was going to have to stand in front of him eventually. And when she did, she needed to know the truth. All of it. Every calculation he'd made, every word he'd chosen, every layer of the decision that had put her on Flight 892 alone at 2 in the morning with a broken heart and no warning. She owed herself that much. The helicopter touched down. Serafina took a breath that hurt her ribs and walked toward it. Down in Chicago, in a glass-walled room at the top of a building that still bore his name on the outside, Dominic Vescari stood with his phone at his side and his eyes fixed on the news feed on the monitor, where a field correspondent was reporting live from the search zone. His assistant was speaking to him. He wasn't hearing her. He was watching the graphic they kept running. Flight 892, missing. And he was doing the math he'd been doing for 20 hours. The cold, iterative calculation of a man who had built his entire life on controlling variables. The variable he hadn't controlled was the weather. He'd sent her away to save her life. He'd made himself into the thing she'd hate, so she'd go without fighting harder, without asking questions he couldn't answer, without putting herself in a position where the people watching him would decide she was useful. He'd run the numbers, and he'd made the decision, and he'd executed it with the precision he'd spent 38 years cultivating. And now Flight 892 was somewhere in the mountains of Tennessee, and no one had confirmed survivors, and the woman he had systematically dismantled himself to protect might be dead. Because the one variable he hadn't accounted for was the one that came from outside the system entirely. His phone lit up. The number was a private federal line, the investigator he'd been negotiating with in the 48 hours before the decision, the one who'd made clear that Serafina's proximity to him made her a liability on both sides. He stared at the number for 3 rings. Then he put the phone face down on the desk. He was still standing there, not moving, hands rigid at his sides, when his assistant said his name a second time. Dominic. He turned. They found it, she said. The plane. It's on the mountain. They're saying there are survivors. He was already moving before she finished the sentence. Hand on the door, coat, keys, everything else irrelevant. The investigator could wait. The Empire could wait. The entire architecture of the decision he'd made could wait. The only thing that mattered was the name on the passenger manifest of Flight 892. But what Dominic didn't know yet, what he was about to discover when he arrived at the rescue center and watched Serafina step off that helicopter with 3 days' worth of mountain survival written across her face, was that the woman who'd boarded that plane believing she was unloved had come down the mountain having rebuilt herself into something his version of protection hadn't accounted for. She wasn't going to run to him. She wasn't going to collapse into explanation. She was going to look at him across a rescue staging area in Tennessee, with medical personnel around her and cameras already gathering and a story already forming that neither of them could control. And the thing in her eyes was going to be something he'd never seen there before. Not love, not hate. Something past both of those. Something that required truth before it could become anything else. And Dominic Vescari, who had spent his entire adult life controlling every room he entered, was about to find out that the only room he'd never been able to control was the one where Serafina Vale decided she was done being protected and started demanding answers. He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. He got in. And somewhere above the Tennessee mountains, a helicopter was already banking south with 31 survivors, one of whom was pressing a borrowed gauze pad to a cut above her eye and thinking about the exact stillness of her husband's hands. The helicopter set down on a gravel lot that had been converted into a staging area sometime in the last 12 hours. Folding tables, portable lighting rigs, a line of ambulances with their rear doors open, a cluster of federal vehicles parked at angles that suggested urgency rather than planning. There were people everywhere. EMTs moving with the particular controlled speed of professionals who'd been awake too long. Local law enforcement holding a perimeter that wasn't doing much to hold back the 3 news vans that had already positioned their satellite equipment along the tree line. Serafina stepped off the helicopter and the cold hit her first, the sharp, clean cold of mountain elevation bleeding into the overcast afternoon. And then the noise hit her, and then the light from a camera rig somebody had aimed at the landing zone, and she stopped moving for exactly 2 seconds while her nervous system processed the shift from 4 days of trees and wreckage and firelight into this. Carl was behind her. James, walking now with a brace someone had found for his neck, was behind Carl. The others came off in pairs, helped by the EMTs who'd rushed the landing zone the moment the rotors began slowing. A woman in a blue jacket reached Serafina first, stethoscope already out. "Can you walk?" "I'm walking," Serafina said. "Head wound?" "4 days old. It's not the priority." The woman gave her a look that said she'd be the judge of that, and Serafina let herself be guided toward the nearest table, where someone had laid out blankets and water, and the particular bureaucratic infrastructure of a mass casualty event. Clipboards, intake forms, a man with a laptop trying to get names matched to manifest numbers. She sat on the edge of a folding chair and let the EMT look at her head, and she drank the water they put in her hand, and she did not look toward the parking area where, 20 minutes later, she was told, a black car had arrived. She knew before they told her. She'd known in the abstract since somewhere around the second day, when she'd had enough silence to think clearly, when the crack in his performance had opened up into something she couldn't close back down. She'd known the way you know things you can't yet admit, because admitting them means accepting the full weight of what they cost. But knowing in the abstract and having him physically present in the same lot were 2 different countries, and she wasn't ready to cross the border. She didn't turn around. The EMT was taping the laceration above her eye with a focus that required her to hold still, and she held still, and she looked at the folding table in front of her and breathed. Then she heard his shoes on the gravel. Dominic Vescari moved differently than other men in crisis. She'd noticed it years ago and never quite found the language for it, the way he seemed to slow down rather than speed up when the stakes went higher, like the machinery inside him ran cooler under load. Most people accelerated toward the thing they were afraid of, burned through the distance on momentum. He covered ground at the same pace whether he was crossing a boardroom or, apparently, a rescue staging area in Tennessee where his wife had just been lifted off a mountain. She heard him stop. She still didn't turn around. Serafina. One word. Her name in his voice, and she felt it land in the middle of her sternum like something thrown hard and accurate, and she hated that, hated the precision of it, hated that even now, even here, her body had its own opinion about Dominic Vescari that was completely separate from what her mind had decided. I need another minute, she told the EMT. Almost done. Serafina, he said again. I heard you. She kept her eyes forward. I'm not ready yet. A pause. She could feel him deciding whether to push. That calculation lasted exactly as long as it always had. He was fast at it. He'd always been fast. And then she felt him hold. He waited. The EMT finished. Patted the tape once, gently, stood. Serafina turned around. He looked terrible. That was the first thing, and it was involuntary, the observation arriving before she could filter it. Dominic Vescari, who in 38 years had never once appeared in public looking like anything other than completely assembled, looked like a man who'd been awake for 90 hours and hadn't eaten, and had spent the interim doing the kind of sustained interior damage that didn't show on the outside until suddenly it showed everywhere at once. His suit was wrinkled. She'd never seen his suit wrinkled. The shadow on his jaw was 4 days past deliberate. His eyes were the thing that stopped her breath for a half second. They were just open. Whatever shield he kept there had come down somewhere between Chicago and this gravel lot, and what was underneath it was so raw that she had to make herself keep looking because her first instinct was to look away. The way you look away from something that isn't meant to be seen. She made herself keep looking. You're alive, he said. Yes. You're... He stopped, started again. Are you... Don't, she said. He closed his mouth. She stood up from the chair. The movement cost her. Ribs, shoulder, the general accumulated debt of 4 days of inadequate sleep and inadequate food and sustained physical duress. But she didn't let it show any more than she had to, and she watched him watch her stand, watched him fight the instinct to step forward and help, watched him hold himself back because he understood, on some level, that reaching for her right now was the wrong move. Good. He still knew how to read a room. We're not doing this here, she said. Okay. There are cameras. I know. And I need to finish the intake process, and I need to talk to the federal coordinator about the other passengers, and I need... She stopped, took a breath that she kept controlled. I need you to give me an hour. His jaw worked. She could see him calculating what an hour meant, what could happen in an hour, whether an hour was a cost he was willing to pay against the alternative of pushing now and having her shut down completely. 1 hour, he said. She turned back to the table. She heard him retreat across the gravel, back toward whoever he'd brought with him, the silent machinery of people who existed in his orbit to manage exactly this kind of situation. She picked up the clipboard the intake coordinator was handing her and she started writing her name, and she did not let herself think about his eyes. The hour passed in this way that hours pass when you fill them with tasks that require just enough attention to keep the rest of it at bay. She talked to the federal coordinator, a compact woman named Sosa, who had the manner of someone who'd been managing disasters long enough to have stopped being surprised by them, about the other passengers, about Carl's triage work, about the structural state of the cabin when they'd found it. She talked to an EMT about the woman with the head injury who'd been evacuated on the first helicopter and was currently in surgery at a hospital in Knoxville. She drank more water. She ate half a granola bar that someone pressed into her hand. She did not think about Dominic. Then the hour was up, and she walked to the black car parked at the edge of the lot, and she got in the back, and he was already there, and they were alone. The car smelled like him. That was a problem she hadn't anticipated. The specific smell of his coat, something between cedar and clean laundry, and the faint trace of the coffee he drank before noon, and it hit her like a physical thing. Involuntary association lighting up the neural architecture of 7 years. She sat against her door with a foot of seat between them and looked straight ahead through the windshield at the staging area and the trees beyond it. Talk, she said. He talked. Not everything. Not yet. She'd understand that later, that he was still calculating, still managing the sequencing of information, releasing what he thought she needed in the order he thought she could handle it. Even now, even here. The habit was so deep in him, it was structural. What he gave her was the shape of it. Federal investigation, criminal exposure, her name appearing in surveillance documents she'd never been told about. He talked about the timeline, when he'd found out how fast it had moved. He talked about the conversation with his attorney, the one where the word leverage had been used. He did not yet say everything. She knew he wasn't saying everything. She could feel the gaps the way you feel a missing step in the dark, the specific absence of weight where there should be weight. She let him finish. Then she turned and looked at him directly for the first time since the gravel lot and said, "What aren't you telling me?" He held her gaze. "I told you the—" Dominic. A beat. "There were threats," he said. "Specific ones. Against you specifically. Not just leverage. Not just legal exposure." He paused. "There were people who decided the fastest way to get to me was through you, and I had 48 hours to make a decision." The car was very quiet. "What kind of threats?" she said. He told her. She listened to it without moving. She was aware of her own breathing, the controlled, deliberate rhythm she'd developed on the mountain, the one that had kept her functional, when functional was the only option. She used it now. Breath in, breath out. Don't let the information arrive before you're ready to receive it. When he finished, she said, "You should have told me." "I couldn't—" "You should have told me," she said again. Not louder, harder. "I am not a variable in your operation, Dominic. I am not an asset you protect by keeping uninformed. I am the person who chose to build a life with you, and you stood across a table and you dismantled me because you decided that was more efficient than trusting me with the truth. I was trying to keep you alive. I know." Her voice stayed level. That steadiness cost her something she couldn't quite name. "I know that's what you were doing. That's not the point." "What's the point?" "The point is that you made a decision for both of us without asking me. The point is that you took away my choice about how to handle my own life and my own danger, and you replaced it with a performance designed to make me leave without asking questions." She looked at his hands in his lap. Still. Too still. The same controlled rigidity she'd identified on the mountainside. "The point is that it worked. I believed you. Every word. I got on that plane believing the man I loved had decided I wasn't worth it anymore." Something moved across his face. She watched it. A flinch that originated somewhere deep and reached the surface in the tight muscle just below his cheekbone before he controlled it back. "And then I nearly died on a mountain," she said, thinking that. The silence that followed was the kind that takes up space, the kind that two people can sit inside and feel differently about. She felt it as pressure. From the way his breathing changed, slightly, just slightly, she thought he felt it as something close to unbearable. "I'm sorry," he said. She'd expected a lot of things from Dominic Viscari in this car. She hadn't expected that with no qualifier attached to it. "No, I'm sorry, but—" or "I'm sorry you felt." Just the two words, plain, delivered in a voice that had nothing strategic left in it. She looked at him. He looked back. "That's not enough," she said. "I know. I don't know if enough exists." He didn't argue. That was new. The Dominic she'd married would have argued, not aggressively, but with the patient, comprehensive logic of a man who believed every problem had a solution if you applied sufficient intelligence to it. This man just looked at her and stayed quiet, and the staying quiet was somehow worse than any argument would have been, because it meant he agreed with her. It meant he understood the full shape of what he'd done and wasn't trying to restructure it. She turned back toward the windshield. "I'm going to Miami," she said. "I have a friend there. I need somewhere that isn't here and isn't Chicago." "Okay." "I need time." "Okay." "I'm not making any decisions right now, about anything." "I understand." She reached for the door handle, stopped. There was something else she needed to say, and she needed to say it while she still had access to it, before the protective distance started rebuilding. "I thought about you," she said. "On the mountain. A lot." She paused. "I thought about the man I've been telling myself you are for 7 years. And I thought about the man you actually were in that lounge. and I was trying to figure out which one was real. He waited. I think I know the answer, she said, but I don't know yet if the answer is good enough. She got out of the car. The next 2 weeks happened in the specific blur of aftermath, the media coverage of Flight 892 and its survivors, which Serafina navigated through her friend's apartment in Miami with the curtains drawn and her phone mostly off. The formal statements to the NTSB and the various federal agencies that wanted pieces of her timeline. The slow, grinding work of reconstructing something that resembled a daily routine from the raw material of a life that had been restructured without her consent. She slept badly. She ate well enough because her friend Margot was the kind of person who expressed concern through food and showed up every morning with something that required actual cooking, and eating what Margot made was easier than having the conversation about why she wasn't sleeping. She ran when her ribs allowed it. She walked along the waterfront in the early evenings when the light went gold and the heat dropped to something tolerable, and she thought. Dominic called once a day. She didn't answer. He texted twice. I'm here. When you're ready. And then, take whatever time you need. She read them both and put her phone down and went back to whatever she'd been doing. She wasn't ready to reward the calls with the response of a woman who was softening. She wasn't softening. She was processing, which was a different thing. Slower and less comfortable and requiring more honesty than softening did. She called Carl once to check on his family. He answered on the second ring and they talked for 40 minutes about nothing connected to the crash. Just two people who'd been in the dark together and needed to confirm the other one was still standing. Before she hung up, he said, You kept people alive on that mountain, you know. You know that, right? We all did, she said. You organized it, he said. That matters. She thought about that after she hung up. She thought about what it meant to be useful in a crisis when no one had asked you to be. She thought about 7 years of being the practical intelligence behind a man who'd never quite said out loud that he depended on it. She thought about 43 passengers on a manifest and the 31 who'd come off that mountain breathing. She thought about what it had taken to keep 31 people alive for 4 days with 3 emergency kits and a granola bar. She thought, I was never the liability he thought I was. On the 15th day, she went for a long walk and sat on a bench facing the water and let herself be honest about what she already knew, had probably known since the second day on the mountain when she'd started seeing the cracks. She still loved him. She hated that she did, and she didn't think love was the issue. The issue was the architecture of the marriage they'd built. Who held what? Who knew what? Who was allowed into which rooms? The issue was that Dominic had constructed a version of their life in which her safety required her ignorance, and she'd let him do it, maybe even enabled it, because it was easier to be the person who managed the surface while someone else managed the depths. She'd been complicit in her own exclusion. That realization sat inside her chest with the particular uncomfortable weight of things that are true and unflattering and can't be unknowed. She took out her phone. She did not call Dominic. She called his attorney, a woman named Hargrove, whom she'd met 4 times in 7 years and disliked on 3 of those occasions, and was now grateful to have the number for. Ms. Hargrove, she said when the call connected, I need to understand the full scope of what my husband is facing. The investigation, the threats, the timeline. Everything, not from Dominic, from you. A pause. That's going to be a long conversation, Hargrove said. I have time. It was a longer conversation than she'd expected. By the time it ended, the sun had gone down and the waterfront lights had come on, and Serafina was sitting on the same bench in the dark, with her phone in her lap, and a picture in her head that was significantly more complicated than the one Dominic had sketched for her in the back of the car. He'd been telling the truth. She'd been correct about that. But Hargrove, who was constitutionally incapable of managing information the way Dominic managed information, had given her the pieces he'd left out. The full scope of the investigation, the names of the people behind the specific threats, and one additional detail that reordered everything she'd been processing for 2 weeks. The federal investigators had approached Dominic 6 months ago, not 48 hours before he sent her to the airport, 6 months. He'd been living with this for 6 months. He'd been sitting across from her at dinner and sleeping in the same bed and having the same conversations and managing the same surface of their life together for 6 entire months while carrying this, and she'd had no idea. None. He'd been so clean about it that she hadn't sensed so much as a shift in atmospheric pressure. For 6 months, she had been the only person in their marriage who was actually present in it. She sat in the dark with that for a long time. And then she picked up the phone and she called him. He answered on the first ring. I talked to Hargrove, she said. The silence that followed was the silence of a man who understood exactly what that meant. Serafina. 6 months, she said. You've known for 6 months. Yes. And you didn't tell me. I was trying to figure out how to... No. Her voice had gone very quiet. That quiet that was worse than shouting. Don't tell me you were trying to figure out how. You had 6 months to figure out how, and what you chose instead was to say nothing until you ran out of time and then to send me onto a plane. He didn't answer. I need you to hear me say this clearly, she said. I can understand a man making a hard decision under impossible pressure. I can understand the lounge. I can almost understand the cruelty of it, given what you thought you were protecting me from. But I cannot understand 6 months of choosing to leave me outside a situation that was my life too. She stopped, steadied. You didn't protect me from danger, Dominic. You just made me live next to it in ignorance while you managed it alone. I know. Do you? Yes. His voice was raw in a way she'd never heard it. I know what I did. I've been sitting with what I did for 2 weeks, and I know. And? And I don't have an excuse, he said. I have reasons, but I know the difference. She pressed her back against the bench. Above her, the Miami sky was doing its thing, that particular orange-black of a coastal city at night, the light pollution turning the cloud cover into something almost beautiful. I'm coming to Chicago, she said, not to come home. Not yet. But I need to hear everything. Not the version you curate for my benefit. Everything. The quality of his silence changed. She'd gotten good, in 7 years, at reading his silences. This one was the silence of a man who'd been waiting for a door to stay closed and was now watching it open and didn't trust yet that what was on the other side was what he hoped it was. When? He said. 2 days. Okay. She hung up. She sat on the bench for another 20 minutes, watching the light on the water, thinking about what she'd said to him in the car. I don't know if enough exists. She still didn't know. But she was starting to understand that the question wasn't whether what he'd done could be forgiven. This question was whether the version of their marriage that existed after this, the one where she knew everything, where she walked into the dangerous rooms instead of being kept outside them, was a version that could actually hold two people. She was going to Chicago to find out. What she didn't know yet, what she wouldn't know until she walked into the building that still bore his name and saw what was waiting for her on the other side of the door, was that the 6 months Hargrove had told her about were not the only thing Dominic had kept in the dark. There was one more piece, one more decision he'd made before any of this started, one that had been operating in the background like a slow fire. And when it came to light, and it was going to come to light, in that building, in that room, because the federal investigation had moved faster than anyone had anticipated in the 2 weeks she'd been in Miami, it was going... She flew into Chicago on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the color of old concrete and the wind off the lake had enough teeth to make itself known through 2 layers of clothing. The city felt different to her than it had 3 weeks ago. Or maybe she was the one who felt different, and the city was just doing what it always did, indifferent and large and moving at its own velocity regardless of what had happened to any particular person inside it. The car Dominic had sent was waiting at arrivals. She'd almost taken a cab out of principle, then decided that refusing the car was the kind of gesture that cost her energy she needed for the actual conversation. She got in. The driver didn't speak. She looked out the window at the familiar geometry of the expressway and thought about what Hargrove had said and what Hargrove hadn't said, and the specific pause that had preceded the lawyer's answer when Serafina had asked, "Is there anything else I should know before I come back?" Hargrove had said, "I think that's a conversation for you and Dominic." That pause, that careful, deliberate deflection from a woman who dealt in precision language and never wasted a word. Serafina had filed it and let it sit for 2 days, and it had been sitting in the back of her skull ever since, quiet and patient and getting heavier. The building came into view through the car window. She'd always had a complicated relationship with this building, the way it wore his name in steel letters across the top, the way the lobby felt like a statement, the way every surface had been selected by someone who understood that environments communicate power before anyone opens their mouth. She'd walked through that lobby hundreds of times and never once questioned the language it was speaking. She questioned it now. The elevator took her to the 42nd floor. His assistant, a composed young man named Elliot, who had mastered the particular art of being present without being intrusive, met her at the doors and told her Dominic was already in the conference room and that there were two other people present she should be aware of. She stopped. Who? She said. Hargrove, Elliot said. And a federal agent. Agent Daria Wren. She arrived 40 minutes ago. He paused, and she could see him calibrating how much to give her. It wasn't scheduled. Serafina took that in. Did Dominic know she was coming? He was informed when she arrived at the lobby. She thought about that for the 3 seconds it took to decide. Then she walked past Elliot toward the conference room, and she didn't knock. The room was glass-walled on two sides, overlooking the city and a gray sky that had begun in the last hour to threaten rain. Dominic was standing at the far end of the long table, not sitting, which told her his body had already registered that sitting was not an option in whatever was happening. Hargrove was to his left with a legal pad and the expression of a woman managing information under pressure. And across the table from both of them was a woman in her early 40s with short dark hair and the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from sustained professional discipline. Someone who had learned to make herself unreadable as a survival tool. Agent Wren. She looked up when Serafina entered. Something moved across her face, assessment, recalibration, and then it was gone. Dominic looked at Serafina. I didn't know she was coming, he said immediately. I know, Serafina said. Elliot told me. She looked at Wren. Why are you here? Wren said, because the timeline moved up. What timeline? Wren glanced at Dominic. He said nothing. Hargrove's pen was very still on the legal pad. The city spread out below them through the glass, indifferent and enormous, doing what cities do. Sit down, Miss Vale, Wren said. I'll stand. Wren looked at her for a moment, then nodded as though she'd expected exactly this answer. She opened the folder in front of her and turned it so it faced Serafina across the table and slid it forward. Inside the folder were photographs. The first was a building, an industrial structure, warehouse category, nothing identifying in the frame. The second was a document, partially redacted. The third was a photograph of Dominic taken through what appeared to be a long lens, on a street Serafina didn't recognize, talking to a man whose face had been blurred in the print. She looked at the photographs. Then she looked at Dominic. His jaw was set. That specific set she knew, not anger, not defensiveness. The expression of a man who has run the calculations and arrived at an answer he can't change, and is now deciding how to position himself relative to it. Tell me, she said. He said, 3 years ago, I made a deal. The words arrived in the room and sat there. Before we moved to the Lakeshore apartment, he said. Before the Miami project. Before any of the last 3 years of what you know as our life together. He stopped, started again. There was a man named Carver. He came to me with a proposition. I was overextended. I'd expanded too fast and 2 of the developments had gone sideways, and I needed liquidity faster than the legitimate channels could provide it. He was looking at her steadily, not flinching, which she understood was costing him. Carver's money was clean on paper. The source of it wasn't. I knew that when I took it. She heard herself say, how much? Enough to save everything that was collapsing, he said. 40 million over 18 months. And the source, his jaw moved. Trafficking. Not direct. Carver ran the laundering end. But the origin of the funds. Stop, she said. He stopped. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she hadn't been since the mountain, since the moment the engines changed pitch, and her body had registered the information before her mind could catch it. That same animal alarm. Something fundamental being communicated through the physical before language could keep up. She looked at the folder on the table. She looked at the photograph of Dominic on the street. She looked at his face. You knew, she said. You knew where the money came from. Yes. When you took it. Yes. The room was very quiet. Hargrove's pen still hadn't moved. Wren was watching Serafina with the professional attention of someone who delivered information like this before and understood that the next 30 seconds were not the time to speak. Serafina said, I have stood next to you at every event, every opening, every dinner for the last 3 years. I have shaken hands with people and smiled and been the version of your life that the public saw. I have done that with money that came from... She stopped, breathed, started again. You made me complicit in something I didn't choose and didn't know about, and had no ability to refuse because you never gave me the option of refusing. That's correct, Dominic said. His voice was steady, and she hated him for it in that moment. Hated that he was steady. Hated that his composure held. Hated that even now the machinery of his self-control was running. Say that again. That's correct? What you said is correct. I don't have a reframe for it. She picked up the folder and then put it down again because she needed somewhere for her hands to go, and she wasn't going to throw it. She was aware of Wren watching her. She was aware of Hargrove watching her. She was aware of the rain that had started against the glass wall, quiet and steady, the drops tracking down the exterior in thin lines. What does she want? Serafina asked, looking at Wren. Wren said, Your husband's cooperation with the full investigation has been ongoing for 8 weeks. What we need now, given the acceleration of the case, is a formal statement regarding the financial timeline. The 40 million, the account structures, the documentation of Carver's network insofar as Mr. Vescari can provide it, and if he cooperates fully. The exposure on this specific count is significantly reduced, not eliminated, but significantly reduced. And if he doesn't, Wren's expression didn't change. Then the case proceeds as constructed, and the exposure on all counts, including the 3 years of operations funded by laundered capital, is substantially worse. Serafina looked at Dominic. 8 weeks, she said. You've been cooperating for 8 weeks. Yes. Before you sent me to the airport. Yes. And you didn't tell me that either. His mouth tightened. I didn't want you in the middle of... I'm in the middle of it, she said, and the words came out with a quietness that was worse than volume. I have always been in the middle of it. I just didn't know I was in the middle of it, which is not the same as being safe. It just means I've been standing in traffic without being able to see the cars. Wren said, Ms. Vale. Serafina looked at her. I need to tell you something directly, Wren said. Your husband came to us. That matters. He initiated the cooperation. We didn't come to him with leverage and extract it. He walked in and he sat down and he offered the Carver network in exchange for a structured resolution. She paused. I've been doing this for 16 years. Men in his position don't do that. They hire lawyers and they stonewall and they wait for the case to run out of momentum. He didn't do that. Serafina said, Why are you telling me this? Because I think you deserve the full picture, Wren said. And because what happens in the next 72 hours depends on decisions that aren't entirely his to make. A beat. What decisions? Serafina said. Wren looked at Dominic. Something passed between them. A look that told Serafina this was the part they'd been building toward, the reason Wren was here today, rather than in a week. Dominic said, Carver knows I'm cooperating. The rain against the glass. How? Serafina said. We don't know yet, Wren said. There's a leak somewhere in the information chain. We're locating it. But Carver has known for approximately 72 hours, which means he's making moves, Serafina said. Yes. What kind of moves? Wren said, the kind that involve making the cooperation less valuable by reducing the number of people who can corroborate the financial documentation. She said it with the flatness of someone saying a factual thing, and Serafina translated it with the part of her that had lived next to Dominic's world long enough to understand how it worked in its darkest architecture. Reducing the number of people. She looked at Dominic. I was looking back at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the controlled blankness of the lounge, not the raw grief of the rescue staging area. Something else. Something that had given up on management entirely and was just present, unmediated, unguarded, the face of a man who had run out of walls to stand behind. Who are the people? She said, and her voice sounded distant to her own ears. There are 3 individuals who can directly corroborate the account documentation, Wren said. 2 are in protective custody. The third... She stopped. The third, Serafina said. The third is a woman named Petra Solano, Dominic said. She managed the accounts for 18 months. She has the documentation that connects Carver's network to the original transaction. He paused. She also has documentation that I didn't know about until last week. Records that Carver doesn't know she kept. Records that, if they reach the federal case file, implicate Carver's entire financial architecture going back 11 years. Where is she? Serafina said. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. She reached out to me 4 days ago, he said. She's in hiding. She won't go into protective custody because she doesn't trust the federal system. There have been 2 previous attempts on individuals connected to Carver's network who were in federal protective arrangements, and both of those arrangements had the same kind of leak that this one has. She trusts you, Serafina said. She trusted me enough to make contact. So she's exposed. Yes. And if Carver gets to her before she can hand over the documentation, then the case against Carver specifically is significantly weakened, Wren said. And Mr. Veskery's cooperation has less value to offer in exchange for the structured resolution. The mathematics of it arranged themselves in Serafina's mind with a clarity she hadn't expected and didn't particularly want. A woman alone. Documentation that could end a criminal network 11 years in the making. A federal case with a leak in it, 72 hours. She looked at Dominic. You need to get to her first, she said. I need to get to her, he said. And I need someone she'll trust enough to come out for. He paused. She won't come out for me alone. After the leak, she doesn't trust any male contact from my side of this. She's had 2 prior approaches that felt off to her, and she went dark both times. He stopped. I told her about you. The room contracted. Dominic, Hargrove said quietly, a warning. He kept looking at Serafina. You told her about me, Serafina said slowly. I told her who you were, what you did on the mountain, the kind of person you are. His voice was low and steady. She asked to speak with you. The silence that followed lasted long enough for the rain to shift against the glass, the pattern of it changing as the wind changed, and Serafina stood in the middle of the room and understood that she was standing at the exact center of something she'd been told she was outside of for 7 years. She was not outside of it. She had never been outside of it. She said, You pulled me back here to ask me to help you. No, Dominic said. I pulled you back here to tell you the truth. All of it. Everything. What you do with it is your decision. He held her gaze. It has always been your decision. I just took too long to understand that it should be. She looked at Wren. If I talk to this woman, she said, and she comes out, and she hands over the documentation, what does that look like for him? It depends on the documentation, Wren said carefully. Best case. Reduced charges. Structured plea. Possibility of no custodial sentence depending on the judge and the full scope of cooperation. She paused. It's not guaranteed. And worst case. 3 to 5 years. Minimum security. With full cooperation and the Solano documentation, the upper end of the federal exposure drops out of the picture. 3 to 5 years. The number sat in the room and they all looked at it from different angles. Serafina turned to face the window. The rain was coming harder now, the city below them gray and wet and moving, all those people down there going about the business of their days with no idea what was happening in a glass conference room 42 floors above them. She thought about what she'd said on the bench in Miami. I don't know if enough exists. She thought about a woman named Petra Solano, alone, somewhere in this city or outside it, sitting with documentation that could dismantle a criminal network, while the clock ran down on whether anyone she trusted would reach her before someone else did. She thought about 31 people on a mountain. The girl in the back of the cabin crying in that quiet, steady way. The system of tasks she'd built out of nothing to keep people alive and moving. She thought about 7 years of standing next to a man she loved while being systematically kept outside the room where his real life was happening. She turned back. Dominic was watching her. Hargrove was watching her. Wren was watching her. The rain was hitting the glass with a sound that was almost rhythmic, almost a pattern, almost like something you could navigate by. Give me her contact information, Serafina said. Dominic went very still. I'm not doing this for you, she said. I'm doing this because a woman alone in a dangerous situation deserves to have someone reach out who understands what that feels like. She looked at him steadily. And when this is over, when Petra Solano is in a room with Agent Wren and the documentation is in the right hands and the clock stops, we are going to have a conversation about every single year of this marriage, and you are not going to manage it, and you are not going to curate it, and you are not going to decide in advance what I can handle. She paused. Are we clear? Yes, he said. I mean it. I know you do. She looked at Wren. I need a phone that isn't on a network Carver's people can access, she said. And I need whatever background you have on Solano before I make contact. And I need to know right now whether your leak has been identified, because I am not walking into a situation where the federal system compromises my safety because someone in your chain is— The phone Wren gave her was a burner, clean number, no registered identity, the kind of device that existed purely as a conduit and nothing else. She held it in her palm in the elevator going down and looked at the contact information written in Wren's precise handwriting on a folded slip of paper. And she thought about what it meant to call a stranger and ask her to trust you based on nothing but the word of a man that stranger already had reasons to distrust. She thought, this is what Dominic does. He moves pieces. Then she thought, no. He moved pieces without telling anyone. What I'm doing, I'm choosing. The distinction mattered. She wasn't sure yet how much, but it mattered. She made the call from the lobby, standing near the window that faced the street, watching the rain come down on the sidewalk and the people moving through it with their heads down. It rang 4 times. Then a voice, low, careful, the particular carefulness of someone who answered unknown numbers with the full weight of their survival instincts engaged. Who is this? My name is Serafina Vale, she said. Dominic's wife. I understand you asked to speak with me. A pause that lasted long enough to have a texture. He told you, Petra said. He told me everything, or close enough to everything that I came back from Miami to deal with it. She kept her voice level. I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm here because a woman alone in a dangerous situation reached out, and I understand what that feels like. Another pause. You were on the plane, Petra said. Yes. I followed the story, the mountain. A beat. You kept people alive. Some of them. That's not nothing. No, Serafina said. It's not nothing. The rain came down. Somewhere behind her in the lobby, 2 men in suits were having a conversation about a merger with the focused energy of people who had no idea what was happening 10 feet away. I need a face-to-face, Petra said. Not a federal facility. Not anywhere connected to his name or his buildings. Where? Petra gave her an address. A coffee shop in Pilsen, South Side. The kind of neighborhood that had enough foot traffic to make 2 women talking unremarkable. 2 hours. I'll be there, Serafina said. She hung up and went back upstairs and told Ren the address and watched Ren's expression go through 3 calculations in 4 seconds before settling on a controlled agreement. Ren would have people in the area, not inside, not visible, but close enough to respond if the meeting went wrong. Serafina understood this and didn't argue about it. She understood the geometry of the situation well enough now to know that arguing about reasonable precautions was a luxury she didn't have. Dominic was still in the conference room when she returned. He looked at her when she came in with the question visible in his face, and she told him what she'd arranged, and he said nothing for a moment. Then, I'm coming with you. No. Serafina, she won't come out if you're there. You know that. You told me that. His jaw tightened. I'm not letting you go alone into... You don't let me do things, she said. Quiet, direct. That's the entire conversation we just had. You don't decide my risk tolerance for me. She held his gaze. I'll have Ren's people on the perimeter. I'll have the burner. I know the address, and I know what I'm walking into. She picked up her coat from the chair. Stand down. The words landed. She watched him absorb them, watched the instinct to override war with the understanding of what overriding would cost. She watched the instinct lose. Call me when you're inside, he said. I'll call you when I'm out, she said. Inside, I need to be present. She left before he could say anything else. The cab ride to Pilsen took 22 minutes through rain-slicked streets. She sat in the back and looked out the window and ran through what she knew about Petra Solano from Ren's briefing. 36 years old, former forensic accountant, had been embedded in Carver's financial operation for 3 years before the nature of the money's origin became clear to her. Had not left immediately when it became clear. Had instead started documenting. Had built, over 18 months, a record that was either the most thorough piece of financial forensics Ren had seen in her career, or the most dangerous thing a private citizen had constructed in the state of Illinois in the last decade, depending on your angle. A woman who'd understood that the only protection available to her was information. Serafina thought, I understand that. The coffee shop was a narrow place on a corner, the kind with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls, and a counter staffed by people who'd worked there long enough to have opinions about the regulars. It smelled like espresso and wet coats. She scanned the room when she walked in and found Petra in the back corner, facing the door, with a coffee she hadn't touched, and both hands visible on the table in the specific arrangement of someone who'd learned to make themselves non-threatening as a default position. Serafina sat down across from her. They looked at each other. Petra Solano had dark eyes that moved with a speed that came from sustained alertness rather than anxiety. The kind of vigilance that had been running so long it had become background process. She was thin in the way of someone who'd been under sustained stress and forgotten to compensate for it. and she had a bruise along her left jaw that was 4 to 5 days old, going yellow at the edges. And she was wearing a jacket that was too large for her, in the way of borrowed clothing. Someone hit you, Serafina said. First approach team, Petra said. 6 days ago. I got away. She said it with a flatness that meant she'd already processed the fear and come out the other side into something more functional. You look like your photographs. You've seen my photographs. I've been thorough about the people connected to this. She wrapped both hands around the untouched coffee. I want to know why you're here. I told you on the phone. You told me a version. I want the real one. Serafina looked at her directly. My husband made decisions for 3 years that put me in the middle of something without my knowledge or consent. The same thing that happened to you, being inside a dangerous situation without full information, happened to me in a different way. And now I'm sitting across from a woman who has documentation that can end Carver's operation. And the federal timeline is moving, and you're alone with a bruised jaw in someone else's jacket. And someone needs to be the bridge between where you are and somewhere safer. She paused. I can be that bridge. Petra looked at her for a long moment. He doesn't deserve you, she said. That's a separate conversation, Serafina said. Right now I need to know if you'll come in. I need guarantees Ren can't give me. What kind? The leak in the federal chain, they've identified it, Serafina said, as of 2 hours ago. Ren told me before I left the building. A paralegal in the U.S. Attorney's Office who'd been compromised through a family member. He's been removed from access and is being managed separately from the investigation chain. She watched Petra's face. Ren said to tell you that directly, that it came from her, not from Dominic's side. Something shifted in Petra's expression. Not relief, something more cautious than relief. The beginning of a recalculation. If I hand over the documentation, Petra said slowly, and Carver's network is dismantled, what happens to me? Ren said witness protection is available, new identity, relocation, the full infrastructure. I have a sister in Portland. That's a conversation to have directly with Ren. But yes, family connections are part of the protective arrangement discussion. Serafina kept her voice steady. Petra, how long have you been running? A pause. 11 months, Petra said. 11 months. Serafina thought about 4 days on a mountain and what that had cost her, and then she multiplied that cost by the weeks and months of sustained hiding, and she looked at the woman across from her with an understanding that went past sympathy into something more structural. It's time to stop running, she said. Petra looked at her hands, then at the door, then back at Serafina. The calculation running behind her eyes was visible. Not sloppy, but visible, the final iteration of a process that had been running for a long time and was arriving at a terminal point. Okay, she said. How do we do this? They were 4 blocks from the coffee shop, walking toward the car Ren had staged on a parallel street, when Serafina's burner buzzed. Ren's number. She answered. Move faster, Ren said. We have eyes on a vehicle that pulled onto the block 20 minutes ago. 2 occupants. They're watching the coffee shop. Serafina kept walking, kept her voice down. How did they find the location? Working on it. Keep moving. Don't run. The car is on Halstead. Blue sedan. Driver's name is Torres. Get in and don't stop. She ended the call and looked at Petra without breaking stride. We need to move, she said. Petra read her face and didn't ask questions. That, more than anything, told Serafina what 11 months of running had done to this woman's instincts. She was faster than most people would be, already adjusting her pace, already scanning without appearing to scan. They turned the corner and the rain hit them directly. No building cover, the wind channeling between the blocks. And Serafina felt it on her face and in her shoulder where the old injury from the mountain still registered cold and impact with equal unhappiness. She kept moving. She saw the vehicle Ren had described before they were halfway down the block. The sedan was parked ahead on the right with its engine running, a thin exhaust curl visible in the rain. Torres. She moved toward it. Then behind her she heard it, the specific sound of a car door opening fast and feet on wet pavement, and the urgency in it that didn't need any translation. She grabbed Petra's arm and ran. The sedan was 30 feet ahead. The sound behind them was 2 sets of footsteps, closing, and someone saying something sharp and clipped that wasn't meant for them but was coordinating between the 2 people behind them, and Serafina was aware of her ribs and her shoulder in the specific clinical way of someone who knows an injury is about to become relevant and is already deciding how much of it she can afford to feel. Torres had the door open before they reached the car. She pushed Petra in first, got in behind her. Torres had the car moving before the door was fully closed. Through the rear window, she saw the two men reach the spot where they'd been and stop, not pursuing into traffic, not producing anything, just stopping with the particular stillness of men who'd been close and understood they'd missed. One of them had a phone already at his ear, reporting. Serafina turned forward and put her back against the seat and breathed. Petra was breathing hard beside her. Her hands were shaking, fine, controlled tremors that she was aware of and didn't try to hide, which somehow made them less alarming than if she'd tried to suppress them. "We're okay," Serafina said. Petra looked at her. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Sound like that. Like you mean it." Serafina thought about a mountain and 31 people and 4 days of saying things that needed to be true more than they needed to be certain. "Practice," she said. Torres took them to a federal staging location, not a field office, a private address, a house in Bridgeport that Wren had been using as a secondary site. Wren was already there when they arrived, which told Serafina that the vehicle tracking had given her enough lead time to reposition. The house was warm and smelled like coffee and old wood, and had the peculiar lived-in quality of a space that had been used for operational purposes long enough to accumulate the artifacts of sustained human occupancy. Wren looked at Petra. Petra looked at Wren. Serafina stepped aside. What followed was 90 minutes she spent in a separate room, sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She drank slowly, listening to the rain on the roof and the muffled sound of voices from the other side of the door. She didn't try to parse the conversation. It wasn't hers to parse. She'd been the bridge. Petra was across. She called Dominic. He answered before the first ring completed. "I'm out," she said. "Petra's with Wren." She heard him exhale. It was the most unguarded sound she'd ever heard from him. Not relief, so much as the sudden release of something that had been held at maximum tension for too long, the specific sound of a man who'd been holding himself together by sheer architecture and had just been given permission to stop. "You're okay," he said. "I'm okay." "And Petra?" "She's okay. She's talking to Wren." She paused. There was a tail. They found the location. His voice changed. "How?" "I don't know yet. Wren's people handled it." She looked at the table. "Dominic." "Yes." "The documentation Petra has, Wren said it's everything. 11 years of Carver's financial architecture. Is that what you understood it to be?" A pause that was too long. "Dominic, I knew she had records," he said. "I didn't know the full scope until Wren told me this morning." Another pause. "If it's what Wren thinks it is, yes. It ends Carver, completely. And you." Silence. "And you," she said again, not a question this time. "The exposure on my end becomes manageable," he said carefully. "With full cooperation and the Solano documentation, Hargrove believes we're looking at the structured plea. Reduced charges. Possible non-custodial." He stopped. "It's not certain, but possible." "Yes." She looked at the rain against the kitchen window. The drops hitting the glass and running, each one separate, each one following the same gravity down to the same edge. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Tell me, if this works, if Carver goes down and you take the structured plea and we come out the other side of this, that is not the end of the conversation." She kept her voice even. "That is the beginning. Everything from the last 7 years gets examined. Every decision you made alone that should have been made together. Every room you kept me out of. Every version of protection that was actually just control." She paused. "I will not rebuild something that has the same architecture as what we had. I can't live in that house again." I was quiet for long enough that she could hear the rain through the phone as well as through the window. A doubled sound, overlapping, slightly out of phase. "I know," he said. "Do you want to rebuild it?" she said. "I need an honest answer. Not the answer that serves your interests right now. The honest one." Another pause. She could almost see him, standing somewhere in that building with his name on it, stripped of every curated surface, just a man trying to locate an honest answer in the wreckage of his own making. "Yes," he said. "I want to rebuild it. I don't know if I know how to be different than I've been, but I want to try. And I understand now that wanting to try is not the same as having the right to ask you to wait." She closed her eyes for a moment. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in years," she said. "I know." The door from the other room opened. Ren came through it with Petra behind her, and the expression on Ren's face was the expression of a woman who'd spent 16 years in federal law enforcement and had just been handed something she'd been building toward for a very long time. "We have everything," Ren said. Serafina looked at her. "Petra's documentation gives us 11 years of clean financial forensics on Carver's entire network," Ren said. "Accounts, structures, transfer records, fronts, all of it." She paused. "We're moving on Carver's people tonight, multiple simultaneous operations, 6 locations." She looked at Serafina steadily. "Your husband's cooperation, combined with this documentation, is sufficient for the structured resolution Hargrove has been negotiating. I'll be making that call in the next hour." Serafina looked at Petra, who was standing with her arms crossed and her eyes dry, and the expression of someone who'd made the hardest decision available to them and was still standing on the other side of it. "Thank you," Serafina said to her. Petra looked back at her. "You came out in the rain for a stranger. You kept documentation for 11 months for people you'd never meet," Serafina said. "We're even." The corner of Petra's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The approximation of one. The kind that means noted, filed. Somewhere in the future, when I have the energy, I will feel this properly. Serafina understood that completely. She put the burner phone down on the kitchen table and picked up her own phone and saw 3 messages from Dominic sent in the last 30 minutes. She didn't read them yet. She looked at Ren. "Tonight," she said, "when your operations move on Carver's locations, is there any residual risk to Dominic?" "There's always residual risk in operations like this," Ren said carefully. "But Carver's attention will be on his own infrastructure tonight, not on peripheral targets. We've assessed the threat level to your husband as significantly reduced once the warrant executions begin." She paused. "The bigger risk tonight is to my people in the field and to the operational security of the simultaneous moves." She looked at Serafina directly. "Go back to him. Be somewhere with him tonight. Let my people do their jobs." Serafina nodded. She called the cab from the kitchen of a house in Bridgeport while the rain kept coming down, and somewhere in the city, federal agents were positioning themselves in parking lots and on corners and in the static surveillance positions of people who had been building toward a single night for a very long time. She sat in the back of the cab as it moved north through the wet streets, and she thought about what Ren had said and what Dominic had said, and what Petra had looked like standing in that back corner of a coffee shop with both hands visible on the table. She thought about 11 months of running. She thought about 4 days on a mountain. She thought about the specific quality of Dominic's exhale when she'd told him she was out. The cab pulled up in front of the building. She got out into the rain and looked up at the steel letters across the top of it and felt something shift in her chest. Not softening, not collapse. Something more structural. A decision being made at a level below language, in the part of her that had been doing the real processing while the rest of her managed surfaces and conversations and the logistics of a crisis. She went inside. He was waiting in the lobby, not upstairs, not in the conference room. In the lobby, standing near the window where she'd made the first call to Petra hours ago, still in the same suit, the wrinkles worse now, the shadow on his jaw another day forward, his hands at his sides in that rigid, controlled stillness she'd learned to read. He looked at her when she came through the doors. She crossed the lobby toward him, and the distance closed, and she stopped 2 feet in front of him and looked at his face, all of it, the open, unguarded version that had appeared at the rescue staging area and hadn't entirely gone back down. And she said nothing for a moment. He said nothing. The rain was audible against the lobby windows. Somewhere above them, 42 floors of an empire in the process of being dismantled and rebuilt into something that might hold a different kind of weight. And here, at ground level, 2 people standing close enough to touch in a lobby that still bore his name, with everything broken open between them and nothing yet decided about what came next. "Ren said go be somewhere with you tonight," she said. "Okay," he said. "I'm not forgiving you tonight," she said. "That's not what this is." "I know. But I'm not leaving either." He looked at her with something in his face that she couldn't name and didn't try to. She turned toward the elevator. He fell into step beside her. The doors opened. They got in. As the elevator began to rise and the lobby fell away beneath them, Serafina stared straight ahead at the closed doors and felt the weight of the night pressing in from all sides. Petra's bruised jaw, the footsteps on wet pavement behind them. Ren's face when she said we have everything. Dominic's exhale on the phone. and she understood that the wreckage was real, and the rebuilding was real, and neither of them was going to be simple or clean or finished tonight. But somewhere in the city, federal agents were moving on 6 simultaneous locations. And the man standing 18 inches to her left was not going to manage her out of a room. The elevator opened on the 42nd floor, and they walked out into the silence of an office building after hours. The kind of silence that has texture. The residual hum of HVAC. The distant sound of the city through triple-pane glass. The soft automatic click of motion sensor lights coming on in the corridor as they moved through it. Dominic's office was at the end of the hall. He unlocked it and held the door, and she went in ahead of him, and he didn't comment on that, just followed and left the overhead lights off and turned on the single lamp on the credenza that made the room amber and smaller and less like a statement. She sat on the couch against the wall. He sat in the chair across from it. Not his desk chair, the chair he used when he didn't want a piece of furniture between him and whoever he was talking to. She'd watched him make that choice in meetings before. She understood what it communicated. Neither of them spoke for a while. The rain was still coming down against the windows. The city below was its own system of lights and motion, indifferent and continuous. Somewhere out there, federal agents were moving into position, executing the simultaneous warrant operations that Wren had been building toward, and neither of them could see it or track it or do anything except sit in a room together and wait for the night to tell them what it was going to cost. "Tell me about Carver," she said. He looked at her. "Not the version you've already told," she said. "The full version. Who he was when you met him. What it felt like to say yes. What you told yourself." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him locate the honest version. Watched him move past the curated one, past the strategically framed one, all the way down to the one that didn't serve him. "I was 34, he said. "I'd built the company from nothing, and I'd overextended it, and I was watching everything I'd constructed start to come apart at the joints. Not fail. Not collapse completely, just start to come apart." He looked at his hands. Carver was introduced through a mutual contact at a conference. He was smooth. He had the right language, the right presentation. He talked about capital liquidity and bridge financing, and I asked the right questions and he had the right answers. He stopped. "I did the due diligence. I found the surface, and I let the surface be enough because the surface was what I needed it to be." "You knew it wasn't clean," she said. "I suspected it wasn't entirely clean," he said. "There's a difference. I told myself the difference was meaningful." He looked up. It wasn't. And then the money worked, and the development stabilized, and the business grew, and Carver became a connection rather than a transaction. And every year that passed made it harder to unwind and easier to maintain, and I got good at not looking directly at the thing I'd agreed to. He paused. "That's the honest version." "What was the thing you didn't look at directly?" she said. "Say it out loud." His jaw tightened. He held her gaze. "That the capital had its origin in human suffering. That somewhere at the bottom of the financial architecture I'd plugged myself into was a network that treated human beings as inventory." He said it without flinching from it. "I told myself the distance was enough. That I was so many removes from the source that the contamination didn't reach me." He stopped. "That was a lie I told myself every day for 3 years. The rain, the city lights, the amber lamp making everything close." "Why did you go to Wren?" she said. "Because 18 months ago I found documentation in my own files that I hadn't put there," he said. Carver had been using the account structures I'd built for my legitimate operations as a secondary laundering layer without my knowledge. He'd gotten into my architecture. He looked at her steadily. He'd made me unknowingly complicit in operations I didn't authorize and wouldn't have authorized. And when I understood what he'd done, I understood that the distance I'd told myself about was gone. That there was no version of continuing that didn't make me directly responsible. He paused. "So I went to Wren, and you still didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because telling you meant showing you who I actually was," he said. "Not the version of me you'd been living with. The version that had taken Carver's money and told himself the story about distance." He stopped. "I was afraid of what you'd do when you saw it." She sat with that. "You were afraid I'd leave," she said. "Yes. So instead you manufactured a reason to send me away." She looked at him. "You understand how that logic works against itself?" "Yes." A pause. "I understand that now. I understood it the moment the plane disappeared from radar." She leaned back against the cushion and looked at the ceiling. The amber light reached the edges of the room and left the corners in shadow, and it was quiet enough that she could hear both of them breathing, not in sync, slightly off phase, two separate rhythms in the same room. I keep thinking about what I thought on the mountain, she said, when I was trying to figure out which version of you was real, the man in the lounge or the man I'd been married to. She looked back at him. I've had weeks to work out the answer. Do you want to hear it? Yes, he said. They're both real, she said. That's the part I had to get to. The man who drove 2 hours in a snowstorm because I mentioned casually that I hadn't eaten. That was real. And the man who took $40 million from a source he knew wasn't clean because he needed the problem to go away. That was real too. And the man who stood in a lounge and performed cruelty he didn't feel to send me somewhere he thought was safer. That was also real. She looked at him steadily. You're not the curated version and you're not the worst version. You're all of it. And I spent 7 years only being allowed to see the curated parts. And what I've been sitting with in Miami and on that bench and in every quiet hour since the mountain is that I don't know if I can love all of it. I know I've been loving the part I was allowed to see. The rest of it, I'm still meeting. He looked at her with the open, unguarded face that had appeared at the staging area and hadn't gone back down. Is that something you want to do? He said. Meet the rest of it. I don't know yet, she said. I'm still deciding. His phone buzzed on the arm of the chair. He looked at it. Then he turned the screen toward her, Ren's number. He answered on speaker. Ren's voice was steady and clipped with the particular compression of someone in an operational moment. Vescari. 6 locations hit simultaneously at 2200 hours. Carver was apprehended at the Wilmette property. 11 arrests total, including the 2 members of his financial team who had direct knowledge of your account structures. A pause. It's done. Neither of them spoke. Hargrove will receive the formal resolution offer from the U.S. Attorney's Office tomorrow morning, Ren said. Based on the Solano documentation and the full scope of your cooperation, the offer will reflect the structured plea we discussed. Reduced charges. Non-custodial recommendation. Another pause. I want to be clear. The judge has final discretion. The recommendation is not a guarantee, but based on what we have, the U.S. Attorney will be arguing for it. Understood, Dominic said. Ms. Vale, Ren said. Yes, Serafina said. Petra Solano is in protective custody as of 2 hours ago. She asked me to tell you. A brief pause, as though Ren was checking something. She said, she came out in the rain. A beat. I think you know what that means. I do, Serafina said. Get some sleep, Ren said. Both of you. Tomorrow is paperwork and it's going to be long. She hung up. The room was quiet again. Outside, the rain had slowed. Not stopped, but reduced to a thin, steady presence, rather than an event. The city lights had the quality they get in the small hours, fewer moving parts, the static structure of the place more visible without the traffic obscuring it. Dominic set the phone down on the chair arm. He looked at her. She looked at him. Non-custodial is not a guarantee, she said. No. There's a version of tomorrow where Hargrove walks out of that office with numbers that change everything. Yes. She looked at his face and she didn't look away from it and she said, Are you scared? He held her gaze. Yes. Good, she said. That's honest. She stood up from the couch. He started to stand and she shook her head. A small gesture, one hand slightly raised, and he held. She crossed to the window and stood with her back to him, looking at the city below. And she let herself be in the full weight of the moment rather than managing it. All of it. The mountain, the lounge, the bench in Miami, the coffee shop in Pilsen, the rain on wet pavement, and the footsteps behind them, the sound of his exhale on the phone when she'd said, I'm out. The 7 years of a marriage that had been real and flawed, and partly hidden, and was now, stripped to its skeleton in the amber light of a late-night office, exactly what it was. No more surface. No more curated distance, just the skeleton. She thought about what you do with a skeleton. You could leave it. She knew that was a real option, had known it since the mountain when she'd looked at the wreckage of the fuselage, and understood that some things that come apart cannot be put back together in their original form. The skeleton of their marriage was real, and it was there, and she was not required to rebuild anything on top of it. But she also thought about what Carl had said. You kept people alive. And she thought about what she'd understood on the bench in Miami, that she'd been complicit in her own exclusion, that she'd accepted the curated version because it was easier than demanding the full one, that the architecture of what they'd built had required her participation to stand. She had helped build the house that kept her outside certain rooms. That was her part of this. Not his sin. Hers. She turned around. I need you to understand something that's also true, she said. Not about you. About me. He waited. I let it happen, she said. Not the Carver piece. I couldn't have known about that. But the structure of it. The arrangement where you managed the depth and I managed the surface, and we both agreed that was how it worked. She looked at him steadily. I didn't ask enough questions. Not because I wasn't smart enough to ask them. Because the answers would have required me to have a harder conversation, and the life we'd built was comfortable enough that I chose comfort over clarity. She stopped. That's my part of this. I own it. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, exactly. Something closer to recognition, the specific expression of a person who's been waiting for a truth to be said out loud and is now watching it happen. I didn't know you felt that, he said. I've had a lot of time on a mountain and a bench, she said. She came back to the couch and sat down closer to him this time. Not touching, but closer. She looked at the space between them and then at him. Here's what I know, she said. I know that I still love you. That's not a decision. It's just a fact I've been carrying around for weeks trying to determine the implications of. She paused. And I know that I cannot go back to what we had. Not the shape of it, not the arrangement of who knows what, and who's protected from what, and who decides what either of us can handle. She looked at him directly. So the question is whether there's something else, something we build from the actual materials rather than the curated ones. He leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees, looking at her from 2 feet away with the face she was going to have to decide what to do with. I don't know how to be a different man than I've been, he said. I told you that on the phone, and I meant it. I know the theory. I've been sitting with the theory for weeks, and I understand it completely. He stopped. Understanding the theory and having the practice are different things. I will get it wrong. I will default to the old patterns because they're structural at this point. They're load-bearing in who I am. He paused. But I want to try. And I will tell you every time I catch myself defaulting. And I'm asking you. I'm asking, not managing, not deciding for both of us, to stay while we find out if trying is enough. She looked at him for a long time. The rain had stopped while they were talking. She became aware of it gradually. The absence of the sound against the glass. The quiet that replaced it. The city at 2 a.m. doing its minimal version of itself. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay, she said again. We try. But I set the terms. Not you. Not Hargrove. Me. She held his gaze. Every room is open. Every decision that affects both of us gets made together. If something threatens us, you tell me before you manage it. Not after, not during, before. I am your partner or I am nothing. There is no middle option. Yes, he said. And if you default, I'll tell you, he said, before you have to ask. I'll hold you to that. I know. She looked at him for one more moment, and then she looked at the window where the rain had stopped and the glass was just dark and reflective now, showing her the room from the outside. The amber lamp, the two of them, the couch and the chair and the space between. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow is going to be hard. He nodded. Neither of them moved immediately. They sat in the quiet of after the storm, after the operations, after the long unspooling of everything that had been hidden, and the room held them in its amber light, and the city went on below, and the night continued its work of becoming morning. The hearing was 4 months later. Serafina sat in the third row of a federal courtroom that smelled like old wood and industrial cleaning product, and the particular staleness of a room where difficult things had been said for many years. Hargrove was at the defense table. Dominic was beside her, in a suit that Serafina had watched him put on that morning with the careful attention of a man who understood that today required him to appear as what he was, rather than what he'd constructed. The U.S. attorney presented the structured plea. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and an expression that gave away less than Dominic's did on his best day, reviewed the documentation for a period that lasted longer than anyone in the room was comfortable with. The non-custodial recommendation held. The judge sentenced Dominic to 5 years of probation, a substantial financial penalty that represented, Hargrove had told them, Approximately 60% of the liquid assets connected to the Carver period operations, and a formal requirement to cooperate with the ongoing federal prosecution of Carver's network as a condition of the probationary arrangement. No prison time. She heard Hargrove exhale at the defense table. She heard the shift of bodies in the seats around her. She sat very still and looked at the back of Dominic's head and watched him absorb the sentence with the stillness of a man who had prepared himself for worse and was now doing the internal arithmetic of what the actual cost meant. He turned and looked at her. She nodded once. Small, direct. He turned back to the judge. Outside the courthouse, in the gray November light with the wind off the lake doing what it always did, they stood on the steps while Hargrove spoke with members of the legal team and the world continued its business around them. Serafina stood beside him, and they didn't touch, and they didn't speak for a moment, just breathed the cold air and looked at the street. 60% of those assets, she said. Yes. What does that leave? Enough to rebuild, he said. Not what we had, but enough. She thought about that. Enough to rebuild. It was, she decided, probably the right amount. Not so little that rebuilding was impossible, not so much that the cost didn't register. The cost needed to register. It needed to be carried forward into whatever came next as a weight rather than a footnote. The lakeshore apartment, she said. Yes. I want to sell it. He looked at her. I'm not coming back to that apartment, she said. We can find something else. Something that isn't built on the arrangement we're dismantling. She paused. I want to start in a place that doesn't have the shape of what we were already pressed into the walls. He was quiet for a moment, then, okay. That's it? Okay? I said I wasn't going to manage your decisions, he said. You want to sell it? We sell it. You pick what comes next. A pause. That's what okay means. She looked at him. Something in her chest adjusted. Not dramatically, not a turning point, just a small internal recalibration. The beginning of evidence. The first data point in the longer project of determining whether okay meant what it was starting to sound like. Come on, she said. Hargrove wants to go over the probationary terms. They walked down the steps together. Petra Solano testified against Carver 7 months later in a separate proceeding that Serafina followed through the news rather than from a courtroom seat. The financial documentation proved to be precisely what Wren had assessed. 11 years of clean forensic records that dismantled Carver's network from the inside out. He was convicted on 23 counts. The sentence was significant and without a probationary option. Serafina read the verdict in the kitchen of the apartment in Lincoln Square that she and Dominic had found together 3 months after the courthouse steps. A third-floor place with wood floors and tall windows, and no history that belonged to either of them. Just a set of rooms they were filling with new evidence of what they were becoming. She read the verdict, and then she put the phone down and went back to the coffee she'd been making. Dominic came in from the other room. He'd been on the phone with Hargrove. The probationary requirements generated a steady, low-level logistics load that had become a regular feature of their week. The bureaucratic texture of consequence. He saw the phone on the counter and looked at her. Carver, she said. He picked up the phone, read it, set it down. Good, he said. Just the one word. She watched him to see if there was more, and there wasn't. Just the word, flat and complete. The appropriate weight of a man who understood exactly what the verdict meant and wasn't going to perform anything around it. She poured 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. They stood at the kitchen counter in the morning light and drank their coffee in the particular quiet of 2 people who have been through enough together that silence doesn't require filling. The call from Petra came 3 weeks after the verdict. Serafina answered it at the window where the afternoon light was coming in at a low angle. The specific light of early February that had no warmth in it, but had a clarity that summer light never quite managed. Petra was in Portland, her sister's neighborhood. She was working, she said, consulting, forensic accounting, the legitimate kind. She sounded different than she had in the coffee shop in Pilsen. Not lighter exactly, more settled. Like a person who had stopped running and was still figuring out what their body did now, that it didn't have to be ready to run at any moment. How are you? Serafina asked. Working on it, Petra said. That's the honest answer. That's the right answer. How are you? Petra said. Serafina looked around the apartment. The wood floors, the tall windows, the coffee cups on the counter, Dominic's coat on the hook by the door. The particular ordinary texture of a life being rebuilt from its actual materials. Working on it, she said. Petra made a sound that was almost a laugh. Good answer. They talked for 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with Carver or federal proceedings or Tennessee mountains, about Portland and Chicago, and the specific challenges of learning to exist in a city where nobody knew your history, about what it felt like to wake up and not run the threat assessment that had been the first mental act of every morning for a very long time. Before she hung up, Petra said, "I think about the mountain sometimes." "So do I," Serafina said. "What do you think about it?" Serafina thought for a moment. "I think about what it asked us to do that we didn't know we could do," she said. "The mountain didn't care about our histories or our damage, or the specific ways we'd broken ourselves before we got there. It just presented a situation and we responded to it." She paused. "I think about that as a model for the rest of it. A beat." "That's good," Petra said quietly. "That's really good." The daughter arrived 14 months after the courthouse steps, in October, when the leaves outside the Lincoln Square apartment were doing what Chicago leaves do, burning through their colors fast and hard before the cold took them. The whole beautiful, necessary process of letting go. They named her Isla. Serafina held her in the hospital room in the late evening when the visitors had gone and the ward had settled into its overnight quiet, and Dominic was sitting in the chair beside the bed, not performing anything, just present, close, the man in full rather than the curated version. And she looked at the weight of this new person in her arms and felt something she hadn't expected. Not simply love, which she'd anticipated, but clarity. The specific clarity of understanding what you're doing something for. She looked at Dominic. He was already looking at her. "She's going to know everything," Serafina said. "When she's old enough. All of it. The real version." "Yes," he said. "No curated version. No managed narrative." "No," he said. "The real one." She looked at Isla, who was doing what very new people do, breathing with her whole body, every breath a full commitment, nothing held back. "The real one includes the hard parts," Serafina said. "It includes the hard parts," he agreed. "That's what makes it real." She nodded. He reached across and put his hand over hers on the blanket. Not Isla's blanket, her hand, the one not occupied with holding their daughter. The gesture was so quiet and so direct and so without performance that she felt it land in the exact center of what they'd been building for the last 14 months. All the evidence accumulating into something she was finally willing to call by its right name. Not the marriage they'd had. Not the curated arrangement with its managed rooms and its comfortable surfaces and its structural exclusions. Something harder and lighter at the same time. Something that had been stress-tested by the specific conditions required to break it and had come through in a different shape than the original. Not restored, not repaired, but transformed, the way materials transform under sufficient pressure, becoming something the original form couldn't have been. 3 years after the verdict, Serafina stood in the lobby of the first community center they'd opened on the south side, watching a Tuesday afternoon program run its course. Teenagers at tables, a woman at the front running a financial literacy workshop with the kind of focused energy that came from personal understanding of the subject matter. Petra had connected them with the curriculum developer. That was how it had started, the idea. A conversation between two women who'd both survived dangerous proximity to money used as a weapon, about what they wished they'd known earlier, about what tools might have changed the shape of their exposure. The center was the tool. Dominic came in from the parking lot with Isla on his shoulders. She was 2.5 now, and had strong opinions about her altitude and expressed them. And Serafina watched them come through the glass doors and felt the ordinary specific weight of that sight. The man she had rebuilt something with. The daughter who would know the real version. The room full of people learning something that might, for some of them, change the architecture of their exposure to the world's harder edges. He set Isla down, and she ran immediately towards Serafina with the full commitment locomotion of a person who had not yet learned to reserve energy for uncertainty. Serafina caught her. Dominic came to stand beside her, and she felt rather than saw him looking at the room. The teenagers, the woman at the front, the afternoon light through the windows. And she didn't look at him for a moment because she didn't need to. She could feel the quality of his presence the way you feel the presence of something that has been through fire and come out changed and is standing next to you in its changed form. Then she looked at him. He looked back. No words. Nothing that needed managing or framing. Just two people in a room they'd built from the materials of their actual lives. The crash, the mountain, the lies, the lounge, the federal courthouse in November, the kitchen in Lincoln Square, the hospital room in October, standing next to each other with their daughter between them and the late afternoon making everything gold. The plane had disappeared into a storm-filled night, and a woman had come down a mountain 3 days later, someone different than the one who'd gone up. Not better, necessarily. Not stronger in the simple motivational sense. Just changed by the specific pressure of the experience into a version of herself, who understood what she was capable of when capability was the only option available. The lies had been what nearly destroyed them. Not the crash, not the threats, not Carver's network, or the federal investigation, or the financial penalties, or the probationary terms. The lies, the sustained, well-intentioned, genuinely protective lies, had done the real damage. And the truth had been, in the end, the only structural material strong enough to build anything that held. She shifted Isla to her hip. Isla grabbed a fistful of her shirt with the proprietary confidence of someone who had never doubted her welcome, and Serafina felt the small warm weight of her and breathed in and looked at the room around her, the people in it, the work being done, the afternoon continuing its business of becoming evening. And she thought, this is what enough looks like. Not perfect, not clean, not without the weight of what it had cost to get here, but real. Completely, irreducibly, unmanageably real. And that, she had learned, on a mountain in Tennessee, in a federal courthouse in November, in a kitchen in Lincoln Square at 6 in the morning over 2 cups of coffee, was the only version worth building.